always considered myself a cautious person, especially when it came to my living space. Growing up in a rough neighborhood in Chicago, I learned early on to double-check locks and be aware of my surroundings. So when I moved to Seattle for a fresh start at 28, I thought I'd left those worries behind. The city felt safer, more open, and I quickly fell in love with my cozy apartment in Capitol Hill. For the first few months, everything was perfect. I'd settled into a routine, made new friends at work, and even started dating again after a messy breakup back home. But then, little things started to feel off. It began with my keys. I always kept them in a small dish by the door, but one morning, they weren't there. I found them on the kitchen counter instead. I brushed it off, figuring I must have been distracted the night before. But then it happened again, and again. Each time I'd find them in a different spot, on the coffee table next to the TV remote, once even in the bathroom. Then I noticed other things. A mug I swore I'd left in the sink was back in the cupboard. My favorite sweater, which I distinctly remember tossing on my bed, was neatly folded in the closet. It was as if some overly tidy ghost was reorganizing my things while I slept. At first I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was more forgetful than I thought. Maybe the stress of my new job was getting to me. But deep down, a nagging feeling grew that something wasn't right. The food was what finally convinced me I wasn't going crazy. I'd bought a pint of my favorite ice cream, planning to treat myself after a particularly tough day at work. But when I went to grab it that evening, it was gone. Not just empty, completely missing from the freezer. I tore through my tiny kitchen, thinking maybe I'd absent-mindedly put it somewhere else, but it was nowhere to be found. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the building, every distant siren from the street below, had me on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in my own home. The next day at work, I must have looked like hell because my coworker Jen pulled me aside. "Are you okay?" she asked, genuine concern in her eyes. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid, but the words tumbled out anyway. I told her everything: the keys, the mysteriously tidied items, the vanishing ice cream. To my relief, she didn't laugh or tell me I was overreacting. Instead, she leaned in close and whispered, "Have you considered setting up a camera?" The idea hadn't even crossed my mind. "Like a nanny cam?" I asked. Jen nodded. "My sister used one when she suspected her roommate was stealing from her. You can get them pretty cheap online, and they're easy to hide." That night, I ordered a small, inconspicuous camera that could easily be mistaken for a USB charger. It arrived 2 days later, and with shaking hands, I set it up in my living room, angling it to capture most of the apartment. For the next few days, nothing happened. I'd check the footage each morning, fast-forwarding through hours of an empty apartment. Part of me was relieved, thinking maybe I had been imagining things, but another part of me knew the mystery was far from solved. It was on the 4th night that everything changed. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. The camera had detected movement. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and opened the app. The footage was dark, lit only by the faint glow of streetlights through the windows. At first, I saw nothing. Then, a shadow moved across the room. I watched, frozen in horror, as a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a man, moving with eerie familiarity through my living room. As he turned towards the kitchen, the light from the fridge illuminated his face. My blood ran cold. It was Mike, my ex-boyfriend from Chicago. Memories flooded back, the volatile arguments, the possessiveness, the reason I'd fled to Seattle in the first place. I'd changed my number, blocked him on social media, done everything I could to disappear. But somehow, he'd found me. I watched, paralyzed, as he rummaged through my fridge, helping himself to my food. He moved to the living room, rifling through my belongings, pausing to smell a sweater I'd worn recently. The intimacy of it made my skin crawl. Before leaving, he did something that chilled me to the bone. He walked to my bedroom door, placed his hand on the knob, and stood there for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he turned away and left, locking the door behind him. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun rose, I called the police. They arrived quickly, and I showed them the footage. Their faces grew grim as they watched. "How long has this been going on?" one officer asked. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "At least 2 weeks, maybe longer." They took my statement and promised to start an investigation immediately. One officer stayed with me while another went to speak with my landlord. It turned out Mike had smooth-talked his way into getting a copy of my key, claiming to be my brother who needed to check on me after a family emergency. The police set up a sting operation, waiting for Mike to return. It took 2 nights, but they caught him red-handed. As they led him away in handcuffs, he looked at me with a mixture of anger and something else, a possessive glint that made me shudder. I changed the locks that same day. The police offered to increase patrols in my area, but it wasn't enough. I couldn't stay in that apartment knowing he had violated my space so thoroughly. Within a week, I'd broken my lease and moved to a new place across the city. Even now, months later, I still find myself double-checking locks, peering into dark corners, and sleeping with one eye open. The feeling of safety I'd found in Seattle is gone, replaced by a constant, gnawing anxiety. I know Mike is in custody, facing charges of stalking and breaking and entering, but a part of me wonders if I'll ever truly feel secure again. Hey there. Hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. And now, I never imagined my college experience would turn into a living nightmare. It all started during my sophomore year at a university in Boston. I was just a normal 20-year-old girl, juggling classes, part-time work at the campus bookstore, and a budding social life. My days were filled with lectures, study sessions at the library, and occasional nights out with friends at local bars. Everything changed on a chilly October evening. I was walking back to my dorm after a late-night study session when my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number popped up. "Nice cardigan. The green really brings out your eyes." I froze, looking around the empty street. There was no one in sight. Shrugging it off as a wrong number, I hurried back to my room. The next day, I received another text. "You seemed stressed in your 10 a.m. class. Hope the coffee helped." My heart raced. How did this person know my schedule? I blocked the number immediately, but it didn't stop. Within hours, a new unknown number texted, "Blocking me won't help, Gina." Over the next week, the messages became more frequent and disturbingly detailed. They mentioned what I ate for lunch, who I talked to, even what page I was reading in the library. I changed my number, thinking that would solve the problem. It didn't. The very next day, a flood of texts came to my new number. Paranoia set in. I started checking over my shoulder constantly, scrutinizing every face on campus. Was it the guy who always sat 2 rows behind me in psych class? The barista at the coffee shop who knew my usual order? I couldn't trust anyone. My grades started slipping. I couldn't focus on lectures, always wondering if my stalker was in the room. Sleep became a luxury as I lay awake, jumping at every sound outside my window. My roommate, Jen, noticed the change in me. When I finally broke down and told her everything, she insisted we go to campus security. The security office took my report seriously. They increased patrols around my dorm and advised me to vary my routine. But the messages kept coming. New haircut? Bold choice. That argument with Jen looked intense. Hope you two are okay. It was like this person had eyes everywhere. I became a shell of my former self. I stopped going out, avoided my friends, and attended classes sporadically. The few times I ventured out, I wore oversized hoodies and sunglasses trying to become invisible, but it never worked. The stalker always knew. One night, after a particularly creepy message detailing what I had written in my private journal, I had a breakdown. I called my parents sobbing, ready to drop out and come home. They calmed me down and promised to come to Boston the next day to help sort things out. That's when things took an unexpected turn. As I was packing, preparing to leave with my parents, my phone buzzed. The message chilled me to the bone. "Don't leave, Gina. We're meant to be together. Check your laptop." With shaking hands, I opened my laptop. To my horror, my webcam turned on by itself. A video started playing, a compilation of clips showing me in my room, changing clothes, sleeping, studying. The stalker had been watching me in my most private moments. Screaming, I slammed the laptop shut and ran out of my room, bumping into Jen in the hallway. Through tears, I explained what happened. Jen's face went pale. "Gina," she said slowly, "your laptop webcam light has been on for weeks. I thought you knew." The realization hit me like a truck. The stalker hadn't just been following me around campus. They had invaded my most personal space. Campus security arrived within minutes of our call. They examined my devices and discovered sophisticated spyware on both my phone and laptop. The investigation moved quickly after that. The IP address of the spyware led them to a computer in the engineering building. The owner of that computer? My lab partner, Marcus. Quiet, helpful Marcus, who always offered to fix my tech issues, who I had trusted with my devices countless times. When confronted, Marcus broke down and confessed. He claimed he was in love with me, that he just wanted to be part of my life. The police found hundreds of photos of me on his devices, a detailed log of my daily activities, and even plans to accidentally run into me at various locations. Marcus was expelled and arrested. The university issued a restraining order, and I thought it was finally over. But Marcus's obsession ran deeper than anyone realized. Somehow, he managed to keep sending messages, even from jail. Sometimes it was through fake social media accounts. Other times through mutual friends he manipulated. I couldn't take it anymore. With the support of my parents and the university, I made the difficult decision to transfer to a school on the other side of the country. I left Boston behind, changed all my contact information, and even altered my appearance. For weeks after the move, I lived in constant fear, waiting for the next message to come. But it never did. The silence was almost as unnerving as the stalking had been. I found myself jumping at shadows, convinced that Marcus would find me again. Months passed, and slowly, I started to rebuild my life. I made new friends, threw myself into my studies, and even started dating again. But I never regained that sense of security I once had. I'm always looking over my shoulder, always second-guessing every new person I meet. To this day, I don't know if Marcus ever truly stopped stalking me, or if he's just waiting, biding his time. Sometimes when my phone buzzes with a text from an unknown number, my heart stops for a moment. The fear never really goes away. It just becomes a part of you, a constant reminder that your world can be turned upside down in an instant. I don't use social media anymore. I'm careful about what I share and who I trust. The experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering, but I refuse to let it define me. I'm more than Marcus's victim. I'm a survivor, carrying an invisible scar, always vigilant, forever changed by those 3 months of terror in Boston. Living in rural Texas has always been my dream. The vast open spaces, the quiet nights, and the freedom to live life on my own terms. It's everything I've ever wanted. I bought this 200-acre farm about 15 years ago, and for the most part it's been paradise, that is, until last summer when things started to get weird. It began with my cattle. I've got a decent-sized herd, about 50 head of Black Angus. They're my pride and joy, and I know each one by sight. So when I noticed something off about old Bessie one morning, I knew something was wrong. She was limping, favoring her left hind leg. I figured she might have stepped in a gopher hole or something. But as I got closer, my blood ran cold. There was a perfect circular incision on her flank, about the size of a silver dollar. It was too clean, too precise to be from barbed wire or a coyote attack. I'd heard stories about cattle mutilations before, but I'd always written them off as tall tales or the work of satanic cults. Now, seeing it with my own eyes, I didn't know what to think. Over the next few weeks, it happened again, and again. Each time, the cuts were different, sometimes on the udder, sometimes near the eyes, but they were always perfectly circular, always impossibly clean. I started losing sleep, spending my nights patrolling the property with my shotgun. But I never saw anything out of the ordinary. That's when I decided to set up trail cameras. I bought a dozen of them, top-of-the-line models with night vision and motion sensors. I placed them strategically around the pastures, hoping to catch whatever was doing this to my animals. For days, nothing showed up on the cameras except my cattle and the occasional deer or raccoon. I was starting to think I was going crazy. Maybe I was imagining things, or maybe some new disease was affecting the herd. But then, on a Tuesday night in August, I got my answer. The footage showed a figure moving through the pasture just after midnight. At first, I thought it was a trespasser, maybe some kids playing a prank. But as the figure moved closer to one of the cameras, I realized with a jolt that I recognized her. It was my neighbor, Mariana. Now, I should explain that I barely knew Mariana. She'd moved into the old Johnson place about a year ago, but kept to herself. We'd wave if we passed each other on the road, but that was about it. She was probably in her late 30s, lived alone, and as far as I knew, worked from home. Nothing about her had ever struck me as odd or threatening. But there she was on my camera, sneaking around my property in the dead of night. The footage showed her approaching one of my cows, producing something from her pocket. It looked like a scalpel or a small knife. And then, I couldn't watch anymore. I felt sick to my stomach. I spent the next day trying to figure out what to do. Should I confront her? Call the police? In the end, I decided I needed to face this head-on. So that evening, I drove over to her place, my heart pounding in my chest. When Mariana answered the door, she looked normal, friendly even, but there was something in her eyes, a kind of intensity that made me uneasy. I cut straight to the chase, told her I had footage of her on my property hurting my animals. I expected her to deny it, to get angry or scared. What I didn't expect was for her to smile. "Oh, Tom," she said, and hearing my name on her lips sent a chill down my spine. "I knew you'd figure it out eventually. You're so smart, so observant. That's one of the things I love about you." I stood there, stunned into silence as she continued. "We're soulmates, Tom. I've known it since the moment I moved here. I've been watching you, learning about you, the cattle. That was just my way of getting your attention. I knew you'd notice. I knew you'd care." She reached out to touch my arm, and I jerked back instinctively. "You're crazy," I managed to say. "Stay away from me and my property, or I'm calling the cops." I practically ran back to my truck, my mind reeling. As I drove away, I could see her in my rearview mirror, standing in her doorway, still smiling. The next day, I went to the police station in town. I showed them the footage, told them about Mariana's confession, but without any concrete threats against me, they said there wasn't much they could do. They promised to issue her a warning, but that was it. I went home feeling defeated and scared. I installed more security cameras, this time around my house. I started locking doors that I'd never bothered to lock before. Every night I'd lie awake listening for any sound that might indicate Mariana was on my property again. Days turned into weeks. The cattle mutilation stopped, but that almost made it worse. Now, instead of having a tangible problem to deal with, I was left with this constant, gnawing fear. Every time I went out to check on the herd, I'd scan the tree line, half expecting to see Mariana watching me. Sometimes I could swear I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I'd turn to look, there'd be nothing there. One night, about a month after I'd confronted Mariana, I woke up to the sound of my dogs barking furiously. I grabbed my shotgun and ran outside, my heart in my throat. The motion-activated lights around the house had come on, illuminating the yard. And there, standing at the edge of the light, was Mariana. She didn't move, didn't try to run. She just stood there staring at me with those intense eyes. "You can't keep ignoring this, Tom," she called out. "We're meant to be together. I'll prove it to you." I fired a warning shot into the air, and she finally turned and ran into the darkness. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, she was long gone. They took a report, promised to step up patrols in the area, but I could tell they still didn't take the threat seriously. After that night, things escalated quickly. I'd find little gifts left on my porch, drawings of us together, chunks of hair that I prayed weren't human, small animals that had been altered in ways I don't want to describe. Each time I'd call the police, but there was never any evidence linking these things directly to Mariana. I stopped sleeping more than an hour or two at a time. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't enjoy my home or my land anymore. Every moment was filled with tension, wondering when Mariana would make her next move, what she'd do next. It all came to a head about 2 months ago. I woke up one night to find all the power in my house had gone out. Even my backup generator wasn't working. As I fumbled for my flashlight, I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. I grabbed my shotgun and burst out of the room, ready for a confrontation. But the hallway was empty. I searched the entire house, every room, every closet. Nothing. But on my kitchen table I found a note. "Soon, my love. Soon we'll be together forever." That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. The next day I called a realtor and put the farm up for sale. I hated the idea of leaving my dream home, the life I'd built here. But I couldn't live like this anymore, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every shadow. As I write this, I'm staying with my sister in Houston while the sale of the farm is being finalized. I haven't seen or heard from Mariana since that night, but I know she's out there somewhere. Sometimes I catch myself scanning faces in crowds, half expecting to see her. I don't know if I'll ever feel completely safe again. I've thought about changing my name, moving across the country, trying to disappear. But a part of me knows that it might not be enough, because the truth is, I don't know how long Mariana was watching me before I noticed her. I don't know how much she knows about me, about my life, and I don't know how far she'll go to prove that we're soulmates. All I know is that I can't go back to that farm. I can't go back to those quiet, dark nights where anything could be hiding just beyond the reach of the porch light. Some dreams, I've learned, can turn into nightmares, and sometimes the only thing you can do is wake up and walk away. Life as a single mom in Chicago wasn't easy, but I managed. My daughter Lily was the light of my life, and at 5 years old, she was growing into a curious, bright-eyed little girl who loved nothing more than her stuffed animals and coloring books. Our routine was simple but comforting. Breakfast together, dropping her off at kindergarten, then racing to my job at the local bank before picking her up in the afternoon. It was a Tuesday in late September when things began to change. I remember because it was unseasonably warm, and Lily had begged to wear her favorite sundress to school. When we got home that evening, there was a package waiting on our front step. It wasn't unusual to get deliveries. I often ordered Lily's clothes online, but this one caught me off guard. It was addressed to Lily with no return address. Inside was a stuffed giraffe, Lily's favorite animal. She squealed with delight, hugging it close. I smiled, assuming it was a gift from my mom or a friend, though I couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. The card inside simply read, "For my special little artist, keep shining bright." I didn't think much of it at first, but then, a week later, another package arrived. This time it contained a set of professional-grade colored pencils, way too expensive for a 5-year-old. The note read, "To color your dreams as vivid as they are." It was odd, but I rationalized that maybe one of Lily's classmates' parents was being overly generous. The packages kept coming, once a week, like clockwork. A personalized backpack with Lily's name embroidered in her favorite shade of purple. A lunchbox featuring characters from her current obsession. A relatively obscure cartoon she'd only recently discovered on streaming. Each gift was perfectly tailored to Lily's tastes, right down to the smallest detail. By the 5th package, my unease had grown into full-blown anxiety. The latest gift was a handmade doll that looked eerily like Lily, down to the small birthmark on her left cheek. The note this time chilled me to the bone. "I love watching you play on the monkey bars at recess. You're getting so strong." That night, after Lily was asleep, I called the police. They took my statement but seemed unconvinced of any immediate danger. "Ma'am, while we understand your concern, sending gifts isn't a crime," the officer said, his tone bordering on dismissive. But he agreed to look into it, taking the packages as evidence. Days passed with no word from the police and no new packages. I started to relax, thinking maybe the sender had been scared off. But then, on a rainy Monday morning as I dropped Lily off at school, I noticed her teacher, Mr. Harrison, watching us intently. He'd always been friendly, if a bit awkward, but something in his gaze made my skin crawl. That afternoon, I received a call from the detective assigned to our case. "Mrs. Gray, we've traced the packages," he said, his voice grave. "They were sent by Lily's kindergarten teacher, Daniel Harrison." My world spun. Mr. Harrison? The quiet, gentle man who'd been teaching my daughter for months? It didn't seem possible. But as the detective continued, the horrifying reality set in. They'd searched Harrison's home and found a room filled with photos of Lily, alongside detailed notes about her daily routine, likes, and dislikes. The school acted swiftly, firing Harrison immediately. But to my shock and outrage, the police said they couldn't press charges. "There's no evidence of any physical harm or direct threats," the detective explained, sounding as frustrated as I felt. "The gifts themselves aren't illegal, and the photos were all taken in public places." I was livid. How could someone so clearly obsessed with my child walk free? The school offered counseling and extra security, but it felt like too little, too late. I couldn't shake the image of Harrison watching Lily, cataloging her every move. We tried to return to normal, but everything had changed. I installed a security system complete with cameras covering every angle of our small house. I changed our routines, taking different routes to school and work each day. I scrutinized every parent, every teacher, every stranger who glanced our way for too long. Lily, perceptive as always, picked up on my anxiety. "Mommy, why can't I play outside anymore?" she'd ask, her big brown eyes full of confusion. I'd make up excuses about the weather or needing to spend quality time together indoors, hating myself for the lies but terrified of the alternative. Weeks turned into months. No more packages arrived, and Harrison seemed to have disappeared, but the damage was done. I jumped at every unexpected sound, triple-checked the locks each night, and struggled to sleep for more than a few hours at a time. Finding childcare became a nightmare. How could I trust anyone with Lily now? I cut back my hours at work, burning through my savings to spend more time at home. When I did have to leave her, it was only with my mother or her best friend's family, and even then, I was a nervous wreck until I had Lily back in my arms. As winter settled over Chicago, bringing with it gray skies and bitter cold, I found myself standing outside Lily's new school, watching her laugh with her classmates through the playground fence. She looked happy, carefree, everything I wanted for her. But I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere someone was watching, waiting. I knew I couldn't protect her from everything, but the thought of letting her out of my sight filled me with paralyzing fear. The rational part of my brain knew Harrison was gone, that the chances of something like this happening again were slim. But rationality had long since taken a back seat to raw, primal fear. One particularly cold morning, as I walked Lily to her classroom, I overheard two other mothers whispering. "That's her," one said, nodding in my direction. "The one with the crazy teacher." I heard she barely lets her daughter out of her sight now. I pretended not to hear, but their words stung. Was I overreacting? Was I letting one disturbed individual rob Lily of a normal childhood? But then I remembered the dolls, the photos, the sickening realization that someone had been watching my little girl for months without my knowledge. No, I wasn't crazy. I was a mother protecting her child in a world that suddenly seemed full of hidden dangers. As I kissed Lily goodbye and watched her skip into her classroom, I made a silent promise. I would find a way to give her the childhood she deserved, one filled with joy and discovery, not fear and suspicion. But I knew it wouldn't be easy. The packages had stopped. Harrison was gone. But the echoes of what happened lingered, a constant reminder that the world could be a dangerous place even in the most unexpected ways. I turned away from the school, pulling my coat tighter against the wind. Another day, another battle against the fear that had become my constant companion. But for Lily, I would keep fighting, keep trying to find a balance between caution and freedom. It was all I could do in a world that had revealed its capacity for unsettling, inexplicable obsession. I never imagined my passion for baking would lead me into a nightmare. As the owner of a small bakery in Los Angeles, I'd spent years perfecting my craft, pouring my heart into every loaf and pastry. My days were filled with the comforting aroma of fresh bread and the satisfaction of creating something delicious. But all that changed when I first noticed him. It was a Tuesday afternoon at my favorite bakery supply store. I was examining a new type of flour when I felt an odd sensation like I was being watched. Glancing up, I caught sight of a man in his mid-40s, average height, with salt and pepper hair and intense blue eyes. He quickly looked away, but something about his demeanor left me unsettled. I brushed it off, finished my shopping, and headed to the farmer's market for fresh strawberries. As I was selecting the ripest berries, I saw him again, pretending to examine some apples a few stalls down. My heart rate quickened, but I told myself it was just a coincidence. LA's a big city, but people can shop at the same places, right? A week later, I needed to restock on high-quality chocolate for a special order. The shop was across town, and as I walked in, there he was again, browsing the display near the entrance. This time our eyes met, and he gave me a slight nod, as if we were acquaintances. A chill ran down my spine. Over the next few weeks, I spotted him more frequently. At first, it was just at places related to my business, supply stores, markets, even outside a competitor's bakery. But then I started noticing him in other places, the parking lot of my gym, the coffee shop near my apartment, even at a movie theater when I went out with friends. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was in the same industry, or lived in my neighborhood. But deep down, I knew something was off. I started paying more attention to my surroundings, always looking over my shoulder. I varied my routines, took different routes to work, and asked friends to accompany me on errands. One evening, as I was leaving my apartment to meet a friend for dinner, I saw him. He was sitting in a parked car across the street watching my building. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. He knew where I lived. I called the police that night, my hands shaking as I dialed. They took my statement but said they couldn't do much without evidence of an actual threat. "Maybe he just likes you," one officer suggested, as if that was supposed to make me feel better. I felt helpless and angry. The next day, I installed new locks and a security system in my apartment. I started carrying pepper spray and took a self-defense class. But the fear lingered, always there in the back of my mind. Weeks passed, and the sightings continued. Sometimes he'd be closer, sometimes farther away, but always watching. I started losing sleep, jumping at every sound. My baking suffered. I burned a batch of croissants for the first time in years. Regular customers noticed my distraction and asked if I was okay. I lied, saying I was just tired. One day, I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I needed to confront him to demand answers. I saw my chance when I spotted him outside my favorite coffee shop. Taking a deep breath, I marched towards him, pepper spray clutched in my pocket. "Why are you following me?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my attempt to sound confident. He looked startled, then smiled. It wasn't a menacing smile, but somehow that made it worse. "I'm not following you," he said calmly. "I'm protecting you." I took a step back, confused. Protecting me? From what? He leaned in closer, his voice low. "From what's coming. They're watching, you know. They know what you can do." My mind raced. Was he delusional? Dangerous? Both? I backed away slowly, ready to run or scream for help. "Your bread," he continued, his eyes intense. "It's special. You have a gift. They want it, but I won't let them take you." I turned and ran, not looking back. My heart pounded as I sprinted down the street, ducking into a busy store. I stayed there for an hour, shaking, before calling a friend to pick me up. That night, I barely slept. His words echoed in my head. What did he mean? Who were they? Was this all some elaborate delusion? The next morning, I went to the bakery early, hoping work would distract me. As I unlocked the door, I noticed something on the step. It was a small loaf of bread, unlike any I'd seen before. Next to it was a note. "They're coming. Be ready." I called the police again, this time insisting they take action. They agreed to increase patrols in the area and took the bread and note as evidence. But as days passed, there was no sign of the man. He had vanished as suddenly as he had appeared. Weeks turned into months. Life slowly returned to normal, but I remained vigilant. I installed cameras at the bakery and my apartment. I changed my routines regularly, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. My baking took on a new intensity. I experimented with new recipes, pushing the boundaries of what I thought was possible. Customers raved about the results, saying my bread was transcendent and like nothing they'd ever tasted. Business boomed. But late at night, when the bakery was quiet and the streets were empty, I'd sometimes think I saw a familiar figure in the shadows, and I'd wonder, was he really gone? Or was he still out there watching, waiting, protecting me from some unseen threat? I never saw him again, never got answers to the questions that haunted me. Life went on, but a part of me remained forever changed by those months of fear and uncertainty. Every time the bell over my bakery door chimes, I can't help but tense up, wondering if this time it might be him. I've been running my little gift shop in Miami for about 5 years now. It's a quaint place tucked away in a bustling neighborhood where I sell handcrafted items and local artisanal products. The shop has always been my pride and joy, a testament to my hard work and dedication. But little did I know that it would become the epicenter of a nightmare that would turn my life upside down. It all started on a Tuesday morning in July. The Miami heat was already oppressive at 9 a.m. when I unlocked the shop door. As I flipped the sign to open, I noticed a delivery van pulling up. A young guy in a crisp uniform hopped out, carrying a beautiful bouquet of sunflowers. I assumed they were for Mrs. Rodriguez next door. She often got flowers from her grandkids. To my surprise, the delivery was for me. The card simply read, "To brighten your day." No sender name. I was flattered, thinking it might be from a satisfied customer. I put the flowers on the counter, their cheerful yellow petals a stark contrast to the muted tones of my shop. The next day, another delivery arrived. This time, it was a dozen red roses. The card read, "You're always on my mind." Again, no name. I started to feel a bit uneasy. I hadn't been seeing anyone, and none of my friends were the type for grand romantic gestures. By the end of the week, I had received 5 more bouquets, each with increasingly personal messages. "Your smile lights up my world," one said. Another read, "We're meant to be together." The last one chilled me to the bone. "I'll eliminate any competition for your heart." I called the flower shop hoping to trace the sender. They apologized but said the orders were placed online with a prepaid credit card. Dead end. As the deliveries continued, I noticed a black sedan parked across the street more often than not. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia, but then I started seeing the same car near my apartment complex. One evening, as I was closing up shop, a man I'd never seen before walked in. He was tall, well-dressed, and had an intense look in his eyes. "Just browsing," he said, but he didn't look at a single item. Instead, his eyes were fixed on me. After a few uncomfortable minutes, he left without buying anything. The next morning, I found my car vandalized. The tires were slashed, and mine was scratched into the hood. I called the police, but without concrete evidence linking it to the flowers or the strange man, they couldn't do much. Things escalated quickly after that. My girlfriend, Helen, started receiving threatening text messages from an unknown number. "Stay away from him," they said. "He belongs to me." When I told her about the flowers and the vandalism, she became scared and distant. I installed security cameras at the shop and my apartment. I changed my routines, varied my routes to and from work. But the feeling of being watched never left me. One day, a new bouquet arrived with a card that made my blood run cold. "I saw you with her last night. You shouldn't have done that. I'll have to teach you a lesson." The sender knew about my date with Helen the previous evening. Desperate, I went back to the police. They took my statement but said that without a direct threat to my life, their hands were tied. They advised me to keep a record of all incidents and to consider a restraining order if I could identify the stalker. As I left the station, feeling helpless and angry, I noticed the black sedan again. This time I managed to catch a glimpse of the driver. My heart nearly stopped. It was the well-dressed man from my shop. I spent the next few days in a state of constant anxiety, jumping at every sound, scrutinizing every customer who entered my shop. My relationship with Helen was hanging by a thread. She couldn't handle the stress and suggested we take a break. One morning, I arrived at my shop to find the lock broken. Inside, nothing was stolen, but every surface was covered with photos. Photos of me at the grocery store, at the gym, having dinner with Helen, even sleeping in my own bed. On the counter was a single red rose and a note. "Soon, my love, soon we'll be together." Shaking, I called the police. As I waited for them to arrive, I noticed a familiar face across the street, the owner of a rival gift shop a few blocks away. He was staring at me with an unsettling smile. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The strange man, the black sedan, the rival business owner, they were the same person. The police arrived, and I told them my suspicions. They questioned the man, but without concrete evidence, they couldn't arrest him. They issued a warning telling him to stay away from me and my property. For a few days, things were quiet. No flowers, no sightings of the black sedan. I started to hope it was over. But then, late one night as I was closing up shop, I heard a noise in the back room. Heart pounding, I grabbed a heavy vase for protection and slowly made my way to investigate. The back door was ajar. As I reached to close it, a hand grabbed my arm. I spun around, coming face to face with the rival shop owner. His eyes were wild, filled with a mixture of love and rage. "We're meant to be together," he whispered, tightening his grip. I reacted on instinct, swinging the vase at his head. It connected with a sickening thud and he crumpled to the floor. With shaking hands, I called 911. The police arrived quickly, along with an ambulance. As they led him away in handcuffs, still dazed from the blow, he kept mumbling about our love and how we were destined to be together. In the days that followed, I learned the full extent of his delusion. He had convinced himself that we were in a relationship, despite us never having had a single conversation. Every interaction he imagined, every date he thought we'd been on, it was all in his head. The police found a shrine dedicated to me in his apartment, along with detailed plans to remove Helen and anyone else he perceived as a threat to our relationship. The evidence was overwhelming, and he was charged with stalking, breaking and entering, and attempted kidnapping. As I gave my statement at the police station, an officer handed me a final piece of evidence they'd found in his car, a bouquet of black roses with a card that read, "Till death do us part." The reality of how close I'd come to God knows what fate hit me like a ton of bricks. The trial was mercifully quick. He was sentenced to psychiatric care followed by prison time. I was granted a lifelong restraining order. But even now, months later, I still find myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if there's another delusional admirer out there, waiting to make me the unwitting star of their twisted fantasy. I was just your average high school junior in suburban Detroit, living a pretty normal life. My days revolved around school, hanging out with friends and dealing with the usual teenage drama. Our neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and nothing exciting ever really happened. That is, until the day my entire world turned upside down. It all started on a chilly autumn evening. I'd just gotten home from volleyball practice, exhausted and ready to crash. As I tossed my gym bag onto my bed, something caught my eye, a tiny glint in the corner of my ceiling fan. At first, I thought it was just a reflection from my phone screen, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my desk chair and climbed up for a closer look. My heart nearly stopped when I realized what I was looking at. There, nestled in one of the fan blades, was a tiny camera. It was so small I almost couldn't believe it was real. But as I stared at it, a wave of nausea washed over me. Someone had been watching me, in my own bedroom. I stumbled off the chair, my mind racing. How long had it been there? Who put it there? I felt violated, exposed and terrified all at once. With shaking hands, I called for my parents. I'll never forget the look of horror on their faces when I showed them what I'd found. My dad immediately started searching the rest of my room, his face growing darker with each passing minute. He found another camera hidden in my bookshelf, disguised as a small ornament I'd had for years. The realization that this wasn't a recent intrusion, but something that had been going on for who knows how long, made me feel sick to my stomach. But the worst was yet to come. My mom, pale and trembling, suggested we check the bathroom. Sure enough, we found 2 more cameras, one in the light fixture and another in the air vent. I broke down crying, feeling utterly violated and unsafe in my own home. My parents called the police right away. I remember sitting on the couch wrapped in a blanket, feeling numb as officers swarmed our house. They treated it like a crime scene, dusting for fingerprints and carefully removing the cameras. One of the detectives, a kind-faced woman, sat with me and gently asked questions about my daily routine, if I'd noticed anything suspicious lately, or if anyone had access to our house. As the investigation unfolded, the police managed to trace the signal from the cameras. What they discovered shook our entire neighborhood to its core. The cameras were linked to a receiver in the house right next door, the home of Mr. Miller, our neighbor for the past decade. Mr. Miller was a middle-aged man who'd always seemed so friendly. He'd attend our block parties, help my dad with yard work, and even cat sit for us when we went on vacation. The thought that this man, someone we trusted, had been secretly watching me for years made my skin crawl. The police searched his house, and what they found was like something out of a nightmare. His basement was filled with computer equipment, screens showing live feeds from not just my room and bathroom, but other parts of our house too. But the worst part was the extensive video archive they discovered. Years and years of footage, all meticulously labeled and categorized. It was like he'd been documenting my entire adolescence. I couldn't eat or sleep for days after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined Mr. Miller's eyes on me, watching my every move. The betrayal and violation I felt were overwhelming. This man had been a part of our lives, someone we considered a friend. He'd watched me grow up, all while secretly obsessing over me in the most disturbing way possible. The entire neighborhood was in shock. Parents held their children close, everyone suddenly suspicious of the people they'd lived next to for years. It felt like our sense of community had been shattered overnight. Mr. Miller was arrested, of course. I thought that would be the end of it, that we could start to feel safe again. But then came another blow. We found out he might be released on bail. The idea that he could be back in the house next door, potentially still watching us, was unbearable. My parents talked about moving, but the housing market was tough and we couldn't afford to just pick up and leave. So instead, we became prisoners in our own home. My dad installed a state-of-the-art security system, complete with cameras of our own. The irony wasn't lost on me, being watched to prevent being watched. I couldn't be alone in the house anymore. The thought of showering or changing clothes filled me with panic. I'd check for cameras obsessively, convinced I'd missed one somewhere. My grades started to slip as I struggled to focus in school, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if someone else was watching me. The worst part was the loss of trust. Every time a neighbor waved or a stranger smiled at me, I'd wonder what their real intentions were. The world suddenly seemed full of potential predators, and I felt exposed and vulnerable all the time. As the legal process dragged on, we learned more disturbing details. Mr. Miller had been doing this for years, not just to me, but to other girls in the neighborhood too. Some of the footage dated back to when I was just starting middle school. The realization that my entire adolescence had been secretly documented and watched by this man was almost too much to bear. My parents tried to shield me from the worst of it, but in the age of social media, it was impossible to escape the gossip and speculation. Some people even suggested that we should have noticed something was wrong earlier, as if it was somehow our fault. The victim blaming, even if unintentional, added another layer of hurt to an already painful situation. Nights became the hardest part. I'd lie awake, staring at the shadows in my room, convinced I could see camera lenses glinting in the darkness. Sometimes I'd swear I could hear the faint whir of a camera focusing, even though I knew it was just my imagination. I started sleeping on the couch in the living room, unable to face my own bedroom. The legal proceedings seemed to drag on forever. Each time we thought it was over, there'd be another hearing, another delay. Mr. Miller's lawyer argued for reduced charges, citing his previously clean record and standing in the community. It felt like a slap in the face, hearing someone defend the man who had so thoroughly violated my privacy and sense of security. As the months passed, I tried to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. I threw myself into my studies and extracurricular activities, desperate for any distraction. But the trauma lingered. I'd flinch at unexpected noises, panic if I saw someone pointing a phone in my direction, and struggle with anxiety attacks in public restrooms. The day of the sentencing finally arrived. I sat in the courtroom surrounded by my family and other victims as the judge delivered his verdict. Mr. Miller was going to prison, but somehow it didn't feel like a victory. No amount of jail time could undo the damage he'd done, couldn't erase the footage he'd collected or the trust he'd betrayed. As we left the courthouse, a sea of reporters waited outside. Cameras flashed and microphones were shoved in our faces, everyone hungry for a statement. The irony of being filmed without consent after everything that had happened wasn't lost on me. We pushed through the crowd silently, heads down, just wanting it all to be over. Back at home, we tried to move forward. My parents talked about healing and moving on, but for me, it felt impossible. Every corner of our house held memories of violation. The fan in my room, the bookshelf, the bathroom. Nowhere felt safe anymore. In the end, we did move. Not far, just to a different suburb, but it was a fresh start. A new house, new neighbors, new routines. But even as we settled into our new life, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd catch myself scanning rooms for hidden cameras, flinching at unexpected reflections. The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. My trust in people, in the safety of my own home, in the idea of privacy, it was all shattered in an instant. And while time has passed and the immediate fear has faded, I don't think I'll ever fully recover from knowing that for years my most private moments were someone else's entertainment. So here I am, trying to piece my life back together, always looking over my shoulder, always wondering, who else might be watching? Working as a nurse in the ER at Phoenix General had always been my dream job. The fast-paced environment, the adrenaline rush of saving lives, and the satisfaction of helping people in their most vulnerable moments. I loved every aspect of it. That was until he started showing up. It began on a typical Tuesday night shift. The ER was bustling as usual, filled with the sounds of beeping monitors and hurried footsteps. I was just finishing up with a patient when my colleague Sarah called me over to help with a new arrival. "Hey, can you take this one? Minor lacerations on the left arm," she said, handing me the chart. I nodded, making my way to the curtained area where the patient waited. As I pulled back the curtain, I was met with a pair of intense blue eyes. The man sitting on the bed looked to be in his mid-30s with disheveled brown hair and a nervous smile. "Hi there, I'm Nurse Amy. What brings you in today?" I asked, glancing at his arm where several shallow cuts were visible. "Oh, just a little accident at home," he replied, his voice surprisingly soft. "I'm Jack, by the way." I cleaned and dressed his wounds, making small talk as I worked. There was something off about his story, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. As I finished up, I noticed him watching me intently. "All done," I said, stepping back. "Be more careful in the future, okay?" He nodded, still smiling. "Thanks, Amy, you're really good at this." I brushed off the compliment and moved on to my next patient, but something about Jack lingered in my mind. A week later, Jack was back, this time with a sprained wrist. Then again 3 days after that with a minor burn. Each time his injuries were just serious enough to warrant a trip to the ER, but not severe enough to raise immediate suspicion. It wasn't until his 5th visit in 3 weeks that alarm bells started ringing in my head. As I treated a small gash on his forehead, I decided to probe a little deeper. "You seem to be having a run of bad luck lately, Jack," I said casually, applying a butterfly bandage. He chuckled nervously. Yeah, I guess I'm just clumsy. Or maybe you're doing this on purpose, I thought, but kept it to myself. As the weeks went by, Jack's visits became more frequent. I started noticing patterns. He always seemed to time his arrivals with my shifts, and his injuries were always just serious enough to ensure he'd be assigned to me. Then, things took a turn outside the hospital. One Saturday morning, I was at my favorite coffee shop, engrossed in a book when I heard a familiar voice. Amy, what a coincidence. I looked up to see Jack standing there, grinning widely. My stomach dropped. Oh, hi, Jack, I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't know you came here. First time, actually, he said, sliding into the seat across from me uninvited. Mind if I join you? I wanted to say no, but I didn't want to be rude. We chatted for a few uncomfortable minutes before I made an excuse about meeting a friend and left hurriedly. But that was just the beginning. Suddenly, Jack was everywhere. I'd see him at the grocery store, at the park where I jogged, even at the gym. Each time he'd act surprised to see me, insisting it was just a coincidence. The final straw came when I found him waiting outside my apartment building one evening. Jack, what are you doing here? I demanded, fear and anger rising in my chest. I just wanted to see you, he stammered. Outside of the hospital, I mean. I think we have a real connection, Amy. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Jack, I'm your nurse, that's all. This behavior needs to stop, now. His face darkened, a look I'd never seen before crossing his features. But we're meant to be together, he insisted, his voice rising. You're just confused. I backed away, my heart racing. Leave now, or I'm calling the police. He stared at me for a long moment before turning and walking away, muttering under his breath. The next day, I reported everything to hospital security. They took it seriously, thank goodness, and Jack was banned from the premises. I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. Though he couldn't enter the hospital anymore, I'd still catch glimpses of him lurking outside, watching. My once peaceful walks home became nerve-wracking ordeals. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sudden noise. One night, working a late shift, I stepped out for a quick breath of fresh air. As I stood in the ambulance bay, I suddenly felt a presence behind me. Before I could turn, a hand clamped over my mouth. Why did you do this to us, Amy? Jack's voice hissed in my ear. We could have been so happy. I struggled, my scream muffled by his hand. Just then, an ambulance turned into the bay, its lights illuminating us. Jack shoved me away and ran, disappearing into the darkness. Shaking, I ran back inside and reported the incident. The police were called, statements were taken, but Jack had vanished without a trace. Days turned into weeks. There were no more sightings of Jack, no more coincidental meetings. The police assured me they were doing everything they could, but without any leads, there wasn't much they could do. I tried to return to my normal routine, but the fear lingered. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every stranger on the street a potential danger. I considered changing jobs, moving to a new city, anything to escape the constant fear. Then, as suddenly as it had all started, it stopped. No more sightings, no more incidents. It was as if Jack had never existed. I never found out what happened to him or why he fixated on me. Sometimes I still catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those intense blue eyes watching me. But they never are. The experience left me shaken, but I refused to let it define me. I still work at the ER, still help people in their most vulnerable moments. But now, I'm always a little more cautious, a little more aware, because I know firsthand how quickly a normal day can turn into a nightmare. I thought I was finally free. After years of a suffocating marriage, the divorce papers were signed, and I was ready to embrace my new life in New York City. The bustling streets and towering skyscrapers seemed to mirror my newfound independence. I threw myself into work, picked up old hobbies, and even started going to the gym again. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. It was a Tuesday evening when I first saw her. I was at a small coffee shop in the East Village, one I'd discovered just a week prior. As I stood in line, my eyes wandered to the window, and there she was, Kate, my ex-wife, walking past on the street outside. My heart skipped a beat. What were the odds? I ducked my head, praying she hadn't noticed me. When I looked up again, she was gone. I brushed it off as a coincidence. New York may be big, but run-ins happen. But then it happened again. 3 days later, I was browsing vinyl records at a tiny shop in Brooklyn. I'd never been there before, having only heard about it from a coworker. As I flipped through a stack of jazz albums, I heard a familiar laugh. I froze, my fingers mid-flip. Slowly, I turned my head. There she was, just 2 aisles over, examining a record. Our eyes met for a split second before I abruptly turned and left the store, my heart pounding. The third time, I couldn't ignore it. I'd decided to try a new Thai restaurant in Queens, way out of my usual stomping grounds. I was halfway through my pad thai when I saw her walk in. She didn't notice me at first, but as the hostess led her to a table, her eyes locked onto mine. She smiled, that same smile that used to make my heart melt, but now sent a chill down my spine. She waved, as if we were old friends bumping into each other. I managed a weak nod before hurriedly asking for my check. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced, trying to make sense of these encounters. It couldn't be coincidence anymore. But how? How was she always showing up where I was? I racked my brain, trying to think of any way she could be tracking me. Then it hit me. Our shared cloud account. We'd set it up years ago to share photos and calendars. In the chaos of the divorce, I'd completely forgotten about it. The next morning, I changed every password I could think of. Email, social media, bank accounts, everything. I deleted the shared cloud account and created a new one, just for me. I even went as far as to get a new phone number. For a few days I felt secure again. I even agreed to a date with a woman I'd met at work. We met at a cozy Italian restaurant in Manhattan. As we chatted over wine and pasta, I found myself relaxing, enjoying her company. Maybe I could move on after all. But as I excused myself to use the restroom, my blood ran cold. There, at the bar, sat Kate. She raised her glass to me, a knowing smirk on her face. I rushed back to the table, made a hurried excuse to my date, and left. From that point on, paranoia set in. I started varying my routines, taking different routes to work each day. I stopped going to my favorite places, always seeking out new, obscure locations. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly scanning crowds for her face. My friends noticed the change in me, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. How could I when it sounded so insane? One night, unable to sleep, I decided to go for a late-night walk in Central Park. The cool air and empty paths calmed my nerves. As I rounded a bend, I saw a figure sitting on a bench ahead. My heart raced as I recognized Kate's silhouette. This time I didn't run. I was tired of running. I approached her, my fists clenched at my sides. "How are you doing this?" I demanded. She looked up at me, her eyes glinting in the moonlight. "Doing what?" she asked innocently. I exploded, listing off every encounter, every coincidence. She listened, that infuriating smirk never leaving her face. When I finished, she stood up. "You always were paranoid," she said. "Did you ever think that maybe, just maybe, we're drawn to the same places? That we still have things in common?" I shook my head, not believing her for a second. She sighed and pulled out her phone. "Look," she said, showing me her screen. It was a location tracking app, but my dot wasn't on it. "I'm not tracking you," she said. "But I knew you'd think I was. You always did jump to the worst conclusions." She pocketed her phone and started to walk away. "Maybe it's time you looked at yourself instead of blaming me for everything." I stood there, dumbfounded, as she disappeared into the night. My mind reeled, trying to process what had just happened. Could it really all have been coincidence? Or was this just another one of her manipulations? As I made my way home, I realized it didn't matter. Whether she was telling the truth or not, she still had this power over me, the ability to make me doubt myself, to upend my life with her mere presence. I entered my apartment, locked the door behind me, and sank to the floor. The city continued to buzz outside my window, oblivious to the turmoil within me. I knew then that as long as I stayed in New York, as long as there was any chance of running into her, I would never truly be free. The next morning, I started looking for jobs in other cities. I didn't know where I'd end up, but I knew I had to go. As I scrolled through listings, a notification popped up on my phone, a new email from an address I didn't recognize. I opened it, my hand shaking slightly. There was no message, just an attachment, a photo of me sitting on my couch looking at my phone, taken through my apartment window. I dropped the phone as if it had burned me. My eyes darted to the window, the curtains wide open. I rushed to close them, my heart pounding in my ears. As I stood there, in the sudden darkness of my apartment, I realized that this was far from over. Whatever game Kate was playing, whatever the truth was, one thing was clear. I wasn't as free as I thought I was, and I had no idea what would come next. Working as a librarian in the small town of Hibbing, Minnesota was supposed to be my dream job. The quiet atmosphere, the smell of books, and the satisfaction of helping people discover new worlds through literature. It was everything I'd hoped for when I moved here from Minneapolis 2 years ago. But now, as I sit in my car outside the library, my hands shaking as I try to gather the courage to go inside, I realize how quickly dreams can turn into nightmares. It all started about 3 months ago. It was a Tuesday afternoon and I was processing returned books as usual. I opened a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, and a small piece of paper fluttered out. At first I thought it was just a forgotten bookmark, but when I picked it up, my blood ran cold. The note read, "Your cat, Mittens, sure does love sitting in the window at 7 p.m. every day." I froze. How did someone know about Mittens' evening routine? I lived alone and my apartment was on the second floor. The only way someone could know this is if they'd been watching me. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe someone had seen Mittens through the window while walking by. I crumpled up the note and threw it away, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. But it didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, more notes appeared in returned books. Each one revealed something personal about my life. "You look cute in that blue sweater you wear every Wednesday. I bet that turkey sandwich from the deli down the street tastes good. Your morning jog takes exactly 23 minutes. With each note, my anxiety grew. I started changing my routines, wearing different clothes, taking different routes to work. But somehow the notes kept coming, always revealing something new and personal. I felt like I was losing my mind, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering who could be watching me so closely. I decided to report it to the police. Officer Johnson, a man I knew from his frequent visits to the library, listened to my story with a furrowed brow. But in the end, he just shook his head. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but without any direct threats or evidence of a crime, there's not much we can do. Maybe it's just some kids playing a prank." His dismissal made me feel even more alone and helpless. I considered quitting my job, but with my student loans and the cost of living, I couldn't afford to be unemployed. So I kept going to work, day after day, feeling like a prisoner in my own life. Then, about a month ago, I noticed him. A man, probably in his mid-40s, always wearing a dark blue jacket. He started coming to the library almost every day, usually staying for hours. At first, I didn't think much of it. We had our regulars after all. But then I realized that his visits coincided with my shifts. Even when I had to cover for a sick colleague at the last minute, he was there. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at me over the top of a book. Other times he'd be typing furiously on his laptop, glancing up at me every few minutes. I wanted to confront him, to demand if he was the one leaving the notes, but fear held me back. What if I was wrong? What if accusing a patron got me fired? The situation came to a head last week. I was working the evening shift and the library was almost empty. As I was reshelving books in the far corner of the non-fiction section, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, and there he was, the man in the blue jacket, standing way too close for comfort. "Can I help you find something?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No, I think I've found exactly what I was looking for." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I opened my mouth to call for help, but before I could, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it out to me. With trembling hands, I took it. As I unfolded it, I recognized my own handwriting. It was a page from my diary, one I kept locked in my bedside table at home. The entry was from 2 weeks ago, detailing my fears about the notes and the mysterious library patron. I looked up at him, terror gripping every fiber of my being. He just smiled again and said, "You should really invest in better locks, Sarah." Before I could react, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the stacks. I stood there frozen, for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. When I finally gathered myself enough to move, I ran to the front desk and called the police. They came, took my statement, and searched the library, but the man was long gone. They're investigating now, but I don't have much hope. I gave my notice at the library the next day. I'm moving back to Minneapolis next week, back to the safety of the big city and away from this small town that no longer feels like home. As I pack up my apartment, I can't help but glance out the window every few minutes, wondering if he's out there, watching. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again, if I'll ever be able to lose this feeling of being watched. All I know is that I need to get out of here, to try and leave this nightmare behind. But deep down, I fear that no matter where I go, I'll always be looking over my shoulder, wondering if the next book I open will contain another note, another piece of my privacy shattered. Working as a receptionist at a busy dental office in downtown San Francisco was supposed to be my stepping stone to bigger things. Fresh out of college with a mountain of student debt, I was grateful for any job that could help me start chipping away at those loans. Little did I know that this seemingly mundane position would lead me down a path of terror that I never could have imagined. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when I first noticed him. The office was bustling with its usual mix of anxious patients and the faint whir of dental equipment. He walked in, a man in his mid-30s with neatly combed dark hair and piercing blue eyes. There was nothing particularly remarkable about him, just another face in the crowd of patients we saw daily. He approached my desk with a polite smile, asking to schedule an appointment for a routine cleaning. As I entered his information into our system, I noticed his gaze lingering on me a bit longer than comfortable. I brushed it off, attributing it to my own self-consciousness. He left with an appointment set for the following week, and I thought nothing more of it. But then he came back, and again, and again. Each time he'd schedule another appointment, always requesting me specifically to handle his booking. At first I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he just preferred consistency in his interactions. But as the weeks went by, his visits became more frequent, and his behavior more unsettling. He'd linger at the front desk, asking me personal questions that felt increasingly invasive. "Do you live nearby? What do you like to do after work? Are you seeing anyone?" I'd deflect as politely as I could, trying to maintain a professional demeanor while silently willing him to leave. One day as I was leaving work, I spotted him across the street, just standing there watching. A chill ran down my spine, but I convinced myself it was just a coincidence. San Francisco isn't that big after all. People run into each other all the time, right? But then it happened again. I was at my favorite coffee shop on Saturday morning, a little place tucked away in the Mission District that I'd discovered shortly after moving to the city. As I waited for my latte, I felt eyes on me. I turned, and there he was, sitting in the corner, pretending to read a newspaper but clearly watching me over the top of it. Our eyes met, and he smiled that same polite smile that now made my skin crawl. I grabbed my coffee and practically ran out of the shop, my heart pounding. This couldn't be a coincidence anymore. the city suddenly felt smaller, more claustrophobic. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sudden movement or sound. The final straw came a few days later. I had just finished a late-night yoga class at my gym, a few blocks from my apartment. As I walked home, keys clutched tightly in my hand as a makeshift weapon, I saw a familiar figure step out of the shadows ahead. It was him. He acted surprised to see me, as if this was just another chance encounter. But I knew better. He knew my schedule, my habits, where I lived. The next day at work, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to my boss, Dr. Bennett, and poured out everything that had been happening. I was shaking, on the verge of tears, desperate for help or at least understanding. But as I spoke, I saw the skepticism growing in his eyes. "Are you sure you're not just being a little paranoid?" he asked, his tone dismissive. "He's one of our best patients, never misses an appointment, always pays on time. I'm sure it's just a series of coincidences." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I tried to explain further to make him understand the fear I was living with, but he just waved it off. "If it's really bothering you that much, maybe you should consider seeing someone. Stress can do funny things to a person's mind." I left his office feeling more alone than ever. The one person I thought I could turn to for help had basically told me I was imagining things. I began to question myself. Was I overreacting? Was this all in my head? But deep down, I knew what I was experiencing was real. The fear was real. The constant state of alertness, the way my heart raced every time the office door opened, wondering if it would be him. It was all real. I started changing my routines. I'd vary my route to and from work, switch up my gym schedule, find new coffee shops. But somehow he always seemed to find me. It was like he had a sixth sense for my whereabouts. One evening, as I was closing up the office alone, I heard the door open behind me. I froze, my back to the entrance, praying it wasn't him. But I knew it was. I could feel his presence, hear his measured breathing. "We're closed," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he replied, his voice sending shivers down my spine. "I've been waiting for a chance to talk to you alone." I turned slowly, my hand reaching for my phone in my pocket. He stood there, blocking the only exit, his eyes gleaming in the dim light of the office. "You've been avoiding me," he said, taking a step closer. "I thought we had a connection. I thought you understood." My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this situation. I thought about Dr. Bennett, about how he'd dismissed my concerns. Would anyone believe me if I called for help? Just as I was about to make a run for it, consequences be damned, we heard voices outside. The cleaning crew had arrived early. The man's head snapped towards the sound, and in that moment of distraction, I bolted past him, out the door, into the safety of the crowded street. I ran until my lungs burned, not daring to look back. When I finally stopped, gasping for air in a well-lit area surrounded by people, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this anymore. The job wasn't worth the constant fear, the sleepless nights, the paranoia that had become my constant companion. The next day, I handed in my resignation. Dr. Bennett seemed surprised, even concerned, but I couldn't bring myself to explain again. I packed up my desk, said goodbye to my coworkers, and walked out of that office for the last time. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that leaving the job solved everything. But even now, months later, living in a different part of the city, I still find myself looking over my shoulder, scrutinizing every face in a crowd. The fear lingers, a constant reminder of those terrifying weeks. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of someone who looks like him, and my heart stops for a moment before I realize it's just my mind playing tricks on me. Or at least I hope it is. As a professor at the University of Texas in Austin, I've always prided myself on maintaining a professional demeanor with my students. For years, I'd cultivated a reputation as a fair, approachable educator who genuinely cared about his students' success. But nothing in my 2 decades of teaching could have prepared me for the nightmare that unfolded during the fall semester of 2022. It started innocuously enough. I first noticed her about 3 weeks into the semester, a young woman with striking green eyes and long, dark hair. She wasn't enrolled in any of my classes, but I kept seeing her in the back row of my lectures on American literature. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's not uncommon for students to sit in on classes they're interested in, especially in the first few weeks when they're still finalizing their schedules. But as the weeks went by, I realized she was attending all of my classes, even the smaller upper-level seminars. She never participated, just sat there, watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that her gaze was always fixed on me, rather than on the whiteboard or her notebook. One day after my introduction to poetry class, she approached me as I was packing up my materials. "Professor Johnson," she said, her voice soft but intense, "I'm Melissa. I was wondering if I could talk to you about your research on Emily Dickinson." I was taken aback. I hadn't published anything on Dickinson in years, and it certainly wasn't a topic I'd covered in any recent classes. "Sure," I replied, trying to maintain a friendly but professional tone. "Why don't you come to my office hours tomorrow?" That was my first mistake. The next day, Melissa showed up at my office right as my hours began. She peppered me with questions about Dickinson, then seamlessly transitioned into asking about my personal life. Where did I grow up? Was I married? Did I have kids? I deflected as best I could, but her persistence was unnerving. This became a daily occurrence. Every afternoon during my office hours, Melissa would appear, always with a new set of questions that seemed designed to pry into my personal life. I started to dread the sound of her knock on my door. Things escalated about a month into this routine. One afternoon, Melissa arrived wearing a low-cut blouse and sat unusually close to me as we talked. When I tried to create some distance, she suddenly placed her hand on my knee. "Professor Johnson," she whispered, leaning in, "I think we have a real connection. Don't you feel it too?" I jerked away, nearly toppling my chair in the process. "Melissa," I said firmly, "this is completely inappropriate. I'm your professor and I'm not interested in any kind of personal relationship with you. I think it's best if you leave now." Her face contorted with rage. "You can't reject me like this," she hissed. "I'll tell everyone you've been coming on to me all semester. Who do you think they'll believe? The respected professor or the poor vulnerable student?" My blood ran cold. I'd heard horror stories about false accusations ruining careers, but I never thought it could happen to me. "Melissa," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "that would be a lie and we both know it. Please, let's just forget this happened and move on." She stormed out of my office, slamming the door behind her. I sat there shaking for what felt like hours. The next day, I went to campus security and reported the incident. They listened sympathetically but said there wasn't much they could do without concrete evidence. They issued a warning to Melissa to stay away from me, but it felt like a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. For the next few weeks, I was a nervous wreck. Every time I stepped into a classroom, I felt like I was walking on eggshells. I started recording all of my lectures just in case I needed evidence later. I kept my office door open during consultations and avoided being alone with any student, male or female. My colleagues noticed the change in my behavior. "You okay, Mark?" my friend in the English department asked one day. "You seem on edge lately." I brushed it off, claiming I was just stressed about a publication deadline, but inside I was screaming for help. The situation came to a head one evening as I was leaving campus late after a faculty meeting. As I approached my car in the dimly lit parking lot, I saw a figure leaning against it. My heart sank as I recognized Melissa. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice from shaking. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I thought we could talk without any interruptions," she said, taking a step towards me. "I've been thinking about what you said, about moving on. But I don't think I can do that, Professor. You've hurt me, and now I need to make sure you understand the consequences." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "Melissa, please," I said, holding up my hands. "This has gone far enough. I'm sorry if I've hurt you, but this needs to stop. Now," she laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that echoed in the empty parking lot. "Oh, it'll stop all right. It'll stop when I say it stops. And right now, I think it's time to take this to the next level." She pulled out her phone and showed me a screen full of text messages. With growing horror, I realized they were fabricated conversations between us, filled with inappropriate comments and suggestions that looked like they came from my number. "It's amazing what you can do with technology these days," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "I wonder what the dean would think if he saw these, or better yet, the local news stations." I felt like I was going to be sick. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to choke out. Her face hardened. "Because I can," she spat. "Because men like you think you can just dismiss people like me without consequences. Well, now you're going to learn what it feels like to be powerless." Just then, a car turned into the parking lot, its headlights sweeping over us. Melissa's head snapped towards the light, and for a moment she looked uncertain. It was enough of a distraction for me to fumble with my keys and unlock my car. "This isn't over," she hissed as I practically dove into the driver's seat. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. The next morning, I went straight to the dean's office and laid out the entire situation. To my immense relief, he believed me and promised to take immediate action. Within days, Melissa was called in for a disciplinary hearing. It turned out I wasn't her first target. She had a history of similar behavior at her previous college. She was expelled, and I was advised to file for a restraining order, which I did immediately. The nightmare was over, but the effects lingered. For months, I jumped at every unexpected noise, scrutinized every student interaction for hidden motives. It took time, but gradually I began to relax, to remember why I loved teaching in the first place. Now, a year later, I'm still at UT Austin, still teaching. But I'm changed. More cautious perhaps, but also more aware of the complex dynamics at play in academia. I don't know where Melissa is now, and I hope I never find out. All I know is that I survived an ordeal that could have easily destroyed my career and my life, and I'm determined to use that experience to become a better, wiser educator. I never imagined my night shift at the 24-hour diner in our small Idaho town would turn into a living nightmare. The place was a local fixture, always bustling with truckers, insomniacs, and the occasional group of teenagers looking for a late-night hangout. I'd been working there for about 2 years, and I knew most of the regulars by name. It was a Tuesday night in late September when I first noticed him. He walked in around 2 a.m., a tall man with graying hair and a neatly trimmed beard. There was nothing particularly remarkable about him, just another face in the crowd. He sat in my section, ordered a black coffee and a slice of apple pie, and kept to himself. For the next few weeks, he became a regular, always showing up during my shifts. At first, I thought nothing of it. Plenty of people had their routines, and maybe the diner was part of his. He was polite, if a bit quiet, and always left a decent tip. But then things started to change. His tips grew larger, sometimes absurdly so. Once, he left a $100 bill for a $10 meal. I tried to refuse, but he insisted, saying I deserved it for my excellent service. It made me uncomfortable, but I couldn't exactly complain about the extra money. Then came the notes. Little scraps of paper left under his coffee cup or tucked beneath the plate. At first, they were innocuous enough. "Your smile brightens my day," or "Thank you for your kindness." But as the weeks went by, they became more personal. "That green sweater really brings out your eyes," one said. Another read, "I hope your sister's wedding went well last weekend." That's when the alarm bells started ringing. I hadn't mentioned my sister's wedding to anyone at work. How could he possibly know about that? I started paying more attention to him, noticing how his eyes followed me as I moved around the diner. He never did anything overtly threatening, but there was an intensity to his gaze that made my skin crawl. One night, as I was walking to my car after my shift, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. I turned to see a figure duck behind a parked truck. My heart racing, I fumbled with my keys and practically dove into my car, locking the doors immediately. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I saw him standing there watching me leave. From that night on, I started taking different routes home. I'd drive in circles, double back, anything to make sure I wasn't being followed. But no matter what I did, I'd often spot his car, an old blue sedan, somewhere along my route. Sometimes it would be parked on a side street. Other times it would be a few cars behind me in traffic. He was always there, always watching. I reported it to the police, but they were frustratingly unhelpful. "Has he threatened you?" they asked. "Has he done anything illegal?" When I said no, they told me there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I document any further incidents and come back if things escalated. My life became a constant state of paranoia. I dreaded going to work, knowing he'd be there. I started asking my coworkers to walk me to my car after every shift. I installed new locks on my apartment door and kept the curtains drawn at all times, but nothing seemed to shake the feeling that I was being watched. One morning, after a particularly stressful shift, I came home to find an envelope slipped under my door. My hands shaking, I opened it. Inside were photos, dozens of them. Photos of me walking to my car, shopping at the grocery store, even sitting in my living room. But the ones that truly terrified me were the photos of me sleeping in my bed. He had been in my apartment while I slept. Panicking, I called the police again. This time, they took me seriously. They increased patrols in my neighborhood and advised me to stay with a friend or family member. I took a leave of absence from work and went to stay with my sister in Boise. For a few weeks, things were quiet. No sightings, no notes, no photos. I started to think that maybe, just maybe, it was over. But then my sister's neighbor mentioned seeing a blue sedan parked on their street several times over the past week. I felt my blood run cold. He had found me, even here. I couldn't escape him. That night, as I lay awake in my sister's guest room, I heard a noise outside the window. A scraping sound like someone trying to pry it open. I froze, my heart pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. The window creaked open slowly. I could see a shadowy figure starting to climb in. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I grabbed the lamp from the bedside table and swung it with all my might as the intruder's head appeared. There was a sickening thud, and the figure crumpled half in and half out of the window. I screamed, finally finding my voice, and my sister came running. We called the police, and they arrived within minutes. As they hauled away the unconscious intruder, I caught a glimpse of his face. It was him, my stalker from the diner. The officers told me they found a camera and a notebook full of detailed notes about my daily routines in his car. They took him into custody, and I gave my statement. The next few days were a blur of police interviews and legal discussions. I learned that he had a history of stalking, that I wasn't his first victim. Somehow that made it both better and worse. In the end, he was charged and convicted. I thought I'd feel relieved, but mostly I just felt numb. I couldn't shake the feeling of violation, the knowledge that for months my every move had been watched and recorded. I never went back to that diner. I couldn't bear the thought of it. Instead, I moved to a new city, started a new job. But even now, years later, I still check my rearview mirror more often than I should. I still keep my curtains drawn. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I swear I can hear the sound of a camera shutter clicking in the darkness. Hey there again. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel. This will really help the channel to grow, and you can be notified of the new videos. And I have something more for you. I chose another video for you to watch. Just click the card here to go to the video. Hope you like it. See you there.